rougher part of Milwaukee, really created this desire to not stay in that environment over time. So that was an impetus. But then my social sustainability side has really been focused on, there's so many people in those environments that are that don't get the same chances. And I'm a white guy, so that gave me 3 extra coins to play the lottery with. But at the same time, there were still a lot of white guys in the neighborhood that have had a completely different trajectory. But if I was black, in that neighborhood, my chances would even be harder. So I empathize with that space, first of all. Then went into General Motors because they paid the most. And so, looking at stability. But I asked them, how do you get ahead in a company like General Motors, at the time, the biggest company in the world? They're like, one guy's like, oh, you need your MBA. And then General Motors were sending people for engineering degrees, for Masters of Engineering. So I signed up, got lucky enough to get chosen. And so I found a place where I could get 2 degrees, an MBA and a master's. And I did that at MIT. So here's this electrical engineering guy who's totally, if you know the Myers-Briggs ESTJ, kind of there's everything's black and white. There's nothing going on. And when you get to MBA school, they say, you know what, you should really go and work for McKinsey, because that's the, MBA. You can either go finance, McKinsey. You don't want to be in this silly automotive world or business world. You want to feed off of the business world. So a buddy of mine says, there's this class called Dialogue Learning and the Consulting Practice. It's got consulting in it. You probably should take that. So I go to this class, and it's actually a class on dialogue, based on David Bohm, who's a quantum physicist from England that did work in dialogue. And then Bill Isaacs, who wrote the book on dialogue, hadn't written it yet, but wrote it based on his classes he was giving, talked about how do you get into this whole new space. And I'm like, whoa, this isn't like engineering space anymore. Something completely different. Well, Peter Senge was a guest speaker, and he's the guy that did learning organization work. And Society of Organizational Learning. So he comes in as a guest speaker, and then I kind of start digging into him, because I'm like, you're supposed to be transparent, but you're in this separate building in MIT I can't get access to. And so then I end up with a relationship with Peter Senge. And then General Motors sends me to Poland to start a factory from the ground up. And so I'm going to have, 500-600 people reporting to me. I had none when I got there. I had to build this whole thing up. And I wanted to do this as a learning organization. So I'm like, I want to create shared vision and mental model work and left-hand columns while we're building cars. And I also wrote a paper then about Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a corporation, which talked about what's the role of a corporation. They're bigger. General Motors is bigger than, or not bigger than all but 20 countries at the time, from a GDP perspective. How do you think about that, right?
Yeah.
What's the role? So try to do that. Played with that a little bit, but in the end, my boss, no, go back and make cars. I'm like, dude, I only came here because I wanted to do this. Spent the last 2 years kind of setting the table. So I went to work at corporate strategy at General Motors. And so that's the kind of place where the guy that's a beautiful mind that rocks in his chair was in there. The chief economist was in there. And then some young up and coming people in the company. So we're learning about game theory applied to business situations. We're learning about genetic algorithms, and we're learning about complexity theory, which was relatively new in the late 90s, and how to apply complexity theory into business world. How do you do system dynamics modeling? How do you do all this kind of stuff? And so it's this little Petri dish of problem solving. And so that kind of kept me on this journey past that, related to problem solving, and always thinking about how do you address problems and what's the right toolkit. And so then they sent me to London. I go do business deals in technology. So I got to do technology business deals. I taught CNN how to sell its content, and designed the content selling, because we wanted to buy it at General Motors to put on our OnStar phones in Europe. So that was really cool, and learned a lot about that type of stuff. Then became a house husband for 10 months in Warsaw, Poland, with my newlywed wife who was working. Normally it's an expat, and the Polish wife is the one that's sitting at home. I was I'd go to these events and they'd be scared of me, because I'm like, what do you do? I was like, well, my Polish wife works. I've just come to the American Friends of Warsaw thing. It's a bunch of women in 7,000 square foot houses. They protect their kids and kept them away from me because they didn't know who I was. I said, yeah, so I'm just sitting here hanging out, and she's my sugar mama. So that gave me 70 books to read on kind of philosophy, physics, quantum physics. And so I spent a lot of time doing that kind of research. We ended up going back and running my parents' business for a couple of years for kind of pro bono to help them kind of grow their business. But then we had a kid, went to a utility company. So now I've gone from automotive to network, and the last one was fulfillment, was the business that my parents had. So like fulfillment, how do you solve problems? And the utility, it's about a network. How do you solve network problems? Because you're trying to keep the lights on, you're trying to keep the gas to people's homes and all that. Ran the continuous improvement, saved $800 million bottom line in about 3-4 years. During the economic crisis, we had one of the best years ever. There's good stories about it. But we were really trying to build capability in people to solve problems. And so we could solve problems there. Got interested then about taxonomy of problem solving. Maybe I'm just talking too much here, but I'm kind of getting...
This is awesome. No, keep going. Yeah, the taxonomy piece is fascinating.
Oh, wait a minute. There's different categories of problems. Like if I drop a ball, normally it's going to fall unless there's a magnet under there and I'm a magician, and then it levitates, right? So I have all these rules that I have to follow, and there's simple things to solve. And most companies solve the simple stuff, right? Because you can take waste out. Toyota's really good at this. But they don't necessarily look at the system all the time. So that's where I did a lot of system work, system dynamics, and you start to link things together. But that still missed 2 quadrants of the way that we could sense the world. So I found the Canavan model. So David Snowden was a few years ahead of me on this problem, thinking about this problem. But he has a sensing model of how to think about the world, and it's clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And that whole complex space is where it gets really interesting, because you can't use the tools in complicated and simple the same way and expect to get an outcome. The reason is, in complexity science, there aren't answers unless you know all the initial conditions, which we hardly ever know unless you start a system that's very controlled and contained. So the world is a complex adaptive system. When you work on poverty, it's a complex adaptive problem. It's not, you can't just like, oh, poverty, just give them money and it's all solved. No, it doesn't work there. So I really started to explore, how do you really address problems? You can't solve them in complexity. You can only address them and change the patterns of behaviors necessary to make things happen. So I spent some time in the local area working on a poverty initiative where we really gained a bunch of multi-stakeholders together in a room, ran multiple experiments, tested those outside the room, came back and then shared the learning so that you could focus on the ability to make transformational change with even small improvements. If you go to Stanley McChrystal's work on like Team of Teams, they used a very similar approach to get El Zarqawi. They didn't have time to understand and look at the data all the time. They had to bring all the data in the room and then make decisions quick. Otherwise, they never would have captured/eliminated him during the time that they were pursuing him. So it's using a different model to approach different problems. And so for me, the entire arc has been, whether I've been in a company running their operational excellence or continuous improvement, or running a factory, or when I'm doing poverty work or doing work in a community to help a community thrive. It's all about thinking about the type of problem and then applying the appropriate systems and tools to get an outcome to occur.